Hello friends, welcome back to the next session on Service Operations Management. Now let's begin with our learning. In this particular session, we'll be understanding and dealing with the concept of interfacing front end with back end, the learning objectives. At the end of this particular session, the learners will be able to understand what do we mean by interfacing front end and the back end, what are the various activities or the important consideration as to interfacing between the front end and the back end, and simultaneously, what are the various activities that have been undertaken in a certain organization with respect to the interfacing front end with the back end. And lastly, what are the various factors that have been associated in the interfacing the front end and the back end activities. Now let's understand what do we mean by the interfacing the front end and the back end activity. So in a particular organization, there are certain type of activities which have been conducted at the front end level, and there are certain activities which have been conducted at the back end level. The activities which are been visible to every person or to the every organization or every participants may it be related to the internal environment or may be related to the external environment are called as the front end activity. And certain activities which are not visible to the general public or to the outside world, but it is being carried out in a certain organization, such type of activities are being called as the back end activity. So a particular activity which has been conducted in front of a certain general public, which is visible to everyone, is called as a front end activity, and a particular activity which has been conducted behind the scenes is called as a back end activity. So in this particular case, in a particular diagram, you can see a front end activity is always visible in a front sense, and a back end activity is visible to a back end people or the people who are running their activity behind the scenes. Now let's understand what is the difference between the front-end activity and the back-end activity. So front-end development is a type of programming or a certain type of activity which usually focuses on the visual aspects of a website or a certain app that will have a user face interaction. So here in this case, the front-end activity always focuses on the major number of public who will be the utmost viewer of a certain information or a certain organization. For this particular consideration, a program has been designed, a certain strategy has been decided as to how visual effects, how the better consideration or the effect is can be provided with respect to the eye contact, with respect to the visual consent to a certain customer, to the people, and so on. And it can be appealing to all the people in the general sense. The backend activity is a part of a concern wherein, in case of a certain website, it is a part of that users don't see usually. So it's conducted at the backend level. It is conducted behind the particular scenes, and accordingly, the users of this particular information are completely different, and they are not able to see what is happening at the backend. Now let's understand what are the various top 8 backend frameworks that are into existence. The various top 8 backend framework or the certain software that can be used is number 1, Django, number 2, Laravel, number 3, Ruby on Rails, number 4 is Cake PHP, number 5 is Spring Boot, number 6 is Phoenix, number 7 is Flask, and number 8 is Express. So these are the various 8 backend frameworks based on which an organization can implement any of those particular frameworks related to the backend activity, and those particular activities can be undertaken in a better consideration. Every activity or every framework or a certain programming is having its own features, and those particular features can be employed and can be used as per the need and requirement of a certain individual, and hence those backend activities can be conducted in a better position. Now let's understand what are the various steps to connect the front end to the backend. Number 1 is creating a run and a sample hello backend microserver using a deployment object. So here in this case, in order to connect the activity of the front end to the backend, a server can be established, and accordingly the microserver can connect the certain activities at the front end level as well as the backend level. Wherein if we need to deploy a certain object, that is a connect or a delivery is been essentially required, then at that particular place a call center can be established, and accordingly those particular activities can be communicated and can be coordinated between the different people. So creating and running a certain activity is essentially important. The second step that needs to be undertaken is using a service object to send traffic to the backend microservice multiple replicas. So in a particular organization, in order to see that those particular activities of front end to the backend have been conducted in an effective way, the communication from the front end to the backend is essentially required, and accordingly one has to see that there is no essence of traffic that is into existence, and accordingly the backend microservice of the multiple replicas is into existence, and accordingly it does not create a certain amount of traffic about how the communication or the information needs to be percolated from one level to another level. The next third and the last step or the strategy that can be undertaken is creating and running a Nginx front-end microservice using a deployment object. So, an object on which either the front-end or the back-end service needs to be deployed. You can use a certain amount of programming or a certain software that is an Nginx, and accordingly, the front-end microservice object can be performed. So, using a certain amount of deployment method in a certain organization, those particular activities can be conducted in a better way, and accordingly the deployment activities can be complied as and when it is been required. Now let's understand what is the importance of the front end along with the backend activity. So a greater looking front end activity can easily fail if the backend isn't strong enough. So here in this case, one has to understand that in order to see that the front end activity is being conducted very effectively and it has been performed, one has to always make sure and has to be very careful about what has been happening at the backend. And hence, unless and until the backend activity is quite strong enough, the front-end activity cannot be conducted in or cannot complete in a better way. All the database interactions and the calculations are handled by the backend people, and which ensures that constant performance is into existence. And hence, for a database interaction which is there into existence, the front-end activity and backend activity should be conducted and coordinated in a very better way. And those particular activities should be of a proper coordination and correlation, wherein each and every activity should not collide with each other, and those particular activities should be complied in the specified time period. The next perspective with respect to the front end and the importance of the backend activities, the majority of the coding is done at the backend level, whereas the code is being executed at the front end level, that is on the respective server and to the customer. So whatever activity or the programming that has been conducted at the backend level, it ultimately gets impacted or presented at the front end level. And hence, for those particular consideration as the part of a software or a certain programming, the activities that is conducted at the backend should be always communicated to the front end executives, and the activity that needs to be performed at the front level should always be taken care of a certain concern that those particular activities are being performed in an effective way at the backend level. Now let's understand which pays a better, that is a front-end job or a back-end job. So depending on a certain job or a certain profession that one has been conducting, there are various technicalities or the sophisticated activity which has been conducted at the front-end level or which has been conducted at the back-end level. With respect to the average compensation consideration, the front-end developer and the back-end developer are earning a certain amount of different compensation. But in both the instances or as both the examples, they always provide an equal opportunity for a certain point of discussion. The front-end executive as well as the back-end executives, everyone is proficient and competent at their respective levels, and each and every activity that is maybe related to the front-end activity or the back-end activity is equally important. So, according to the Glassdoor, the average compensation for either a front-end developer or a back-end developer is $76,929. So, it's just a standard value that has been associated, and it may differ from individual to individual, person to person, process to process, and activity to activity. And hence, this depending on the knowledge, skill, technical proficiency, and so on, the profession or the payment consideration may differ for a front-end developer or a back-end developer, or a particular person who is performing his activities in the front-end manufacturing or a particular organization or at the back-end level. Now let's understand, is front-end difficult or is back-end difficult? So front-end web development is more difficult than the back-end development because it considers the more frequent modifications which has been undertaken for a several point of time. So the front-end activity is to be considered of a very difficult nature because we have to handle several number of activities which will be actually displayed, and accordingly if the particular display goes wrong or if a certain portray of a certain activity is not being into a proper concern, then accordingly the image of the organization may spoil or it may get ruined. But in case of a certain backend activity which is not visible to any of the person or a certain consideration, the programming may take place on a continuous basis, and hence the backend activity is not often much utmost importance. And hence the front end activity is essentially important, it is essentially difficult, and the backend activity is also not of a major consideration of how those particular activities can be undertaken. Hence, it is however important to see that how do we develop or how do we create our own skill sets, that is depending on what skills an individual possesses, and based on those particular skill sets one individual has to develop and identify what skills can be implemented in a certain organization. The next concern one has to see is what are the various abilities that have been associated with a certain individual. That is, what skills needs to be employed, what ability needs to be utilized, and so on. So every individual activity that has been conducted may be difficult or different from each other, and hence every activity is equally important. May it be related to the front end activity or may be related to the back end activity, but primary focus is always provided for the front end activity, and hence the performance or the result orientation as to the front end activity is essentially important. Now let's understand what are the various front end and the back end development tools that can be implemented or that can be used in an organization. The various tools for the front end and the back end development tools are: number one, that is HTML; number two, that is CSS, a certain amount of software; number three is the JavaScript; and number four are the various software that can be implemented, which may be related to Oracle, or Teradata, a Microsoft SQL Server, IBM DB2, Enterprise Database, and a SAP Sybase ASE. So in this way, those particular softwares can be used, or a certain backend or a front-end development tools can be implemented in certain organization, and those particular concerns can provide a benefit to a certain concern. So here in this case, we come to an understanding that both the activities may it be related to the front end activity or the back end activity, the development and the collaboration of the activities and the mechanism needs to be there in an effective way. And whether you are looking for an app development or a website development, whether the activity is being performed either physically or through the technological mode, both the activities or the function needs to be performed in a very effective way. And as well as at the other end, it is also having an opposing queries. That is, which performance or which priority needs to be given either to the front end activity or to the back end activity, because each and every individual activity is essentially important and there is no differentiation as to which activity should be prioritized and which activity should not be prioritized. The user interface in this particular concern is referred to as a front end, whereas the server and the program that operates at the behind the scenes is called or is been referred as the backend. And hence, the one or the thing that has been visible to the general public or which has been conducted at the initial level is called the front end activity. That is a user interface which is available to the general public, and the database or the activity or the programming that has been conducted beyond the scenes or behind these particular scenes is called as the backend activity. Now let's summarize what we have learned in this particular session. In this particular session, we have understood what is meant by the interfacing the activity of the front-end activity and the back-end activity. What are the various activities that have been performed at in the case of interfacing the front-end and the back-end activity. And lastly, what are the various benefits that have been associated for conducting the front-end as well as the back-end activity. I hope you must have enjoyed the learning at this particular stage. Thank you for your patience listening. Thank you.